They thought she was just a lowly servant, a nameless girl meant to scrub stone floors until her hands cracked. So when the ruthless Alpha King bypassed every high-born lady to claim her, the court roared with laughter. But their mockery turned to sheer terror when her true destiny awakened. In the harsh, unforgiving stone corridors of the Winterbourne Keep, the air was perpetually thick with the smell of wood smoke, roasting meats, and the sharp tang of anxiety. Evelyn Mercer knelt on the freezing slate, her raw, blistered hands wringing out a coarse rag into a wooden bucket of murky water. She was 19, invisible, and precisely where she wanted to be, hidden in plain sight. In the kingdom of Ethelgard, where lycanthropy was not a curse but a divine right of the ruling class, humans and low-ranking wolves alike lived at the mercy of the nobility. Aveline was classified as the lowest of the low, a supposedly scentless, shiftless human orphan taken in by the castle's scullery out of reluctant charity. But Aveline harbored a fatal secret. Beneath the layers of coarse linen and the deliberate smears of hearth ash she rubbed into her skin every morning, she possessed a scent that terrified her. It was a fragrance of crushed pine, midnight rain, and something ancient that made the elder wolves of the keep pace restlessly on full moon nights. To survive, Aveline washed in harsh lye soap and slept near the pungent sulphur pits in the lower cellars, masking her existence from the heightened senses of the ruling alphas. Today, the keep was in an absolute frenzy. King Cedric Valerius, the fearsome alpha of the northern reaches, was returning from a brutal 3-year campaign against the rogue factions of the Crimson Ridge. Cedric was a legend rendered in flesh, a massive, unyielding warrior whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his terrifying wolf form. More importantly to the courtiers of Winterbourne, Cedric was returning unwed. The kingdom desperately needed a Luna, a queen to stabilize the shifting political alliances and bear the next heir. "Faster, you useless girl!" snapped head maid Winifred, her heavy leather shoes clicking sharply against the wet stone. "Lord Percival's carriage has already crossed the drawbridge, and Lady Beatrice will have my head if the grand hall is not spotless." Aveline ducked her head, scrubbing harder at a stubborn stain near the great hearth. Lady Beatrice of the House of Harrington was the undisputed favourite to win the king's favour. Beautiful, cunning, and born from a pure-blood lineage that boasted generals and wealth, Beatrice had already begun acting as the de facto queen of the keep. She wore gowns of spun gold and emerald silk, her natural scent of sweet jasmine artificially amplified by expensive perfumes brought in from the southern ports. As the afternoon waned, the trumpets sounded from the battlements, a deep, resonating blast that shook the very foundations of the keep. The Alpha King had arrived. Aveline retreated to the shadows of the servants' corridor, peering through the iron-wrought grating that overlooked the main courtyard. King Cedric rode a massive black destrier, his broad shoulders draped in a heavy cloak of dark, dire wolf fur. His face was a landscape of harsh angles and battle-hardened resolve, his jaw sharp and his dark eyes sweeping over the welcoming committee with calculating indifference. He did not smile as the lords and ladies bowed deeply. He merely dismounted with lethal grace, his presence commanding absolute, suffocating submission. Even from her hidden vantage point, Aveline felt the sheer weight of his aura. It pushed against her chest, a dominant, invisible force that demanded absolute obedience. She felt a strange, terrifying flutter in her rib cage, a primal recognition that made her breath hitch. Frantically, she backed away, retreating into the depths of the kitchens. The evening descended into a lavish, chaotic feast. The great hall was bathed in the warm, flickering light of 1,000 tallow candles. Enormous boars were roasted on spits, and barrels of deep red wine from the Ethelgard vineyards were cracked open. The high-born wolves sat at the elevated tables, their laughter loud, their eyes flashing with predatory ambition. Aveline was tasked with serving the high table, a dangerous assignment she had begged Winifred to avoid. She kept her head bowed, her rough spun dress blending into the shadows as she carried heavy silver pitchers of wine. As she approached the dais, the political theatre was in full swing. Lady Beatrice sat perilously close to King Cedric's right, leaning in to whisper in his ear, her hand lingering on the arm of his heavy oaken chair. "Your Majesty," Beatrice purred, her voice carrying over the din of the hall. "The realm rejoices at your victory, but a king cannot rule alone forever. The pack grows anxious for a mother, for a true pureblood Luna to guide the young." Cedric stared straight ahead, his expression unreadable. He took a slow sip from his goblet. "The realm will have a Luna when the goddess deems it so, Lady Beatrice. I will not bind my soul to a political treaty." Aveline stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly as she reached to refill Lord Percival's cup, just a few feet from the king. As she poured, a sudden, violent draught swept through the great hall, blowing open the massive oak doors at the far end. The wind extinguished a dozen candles, and more disastrously, it blew the scent-masking ash and sulphur right off Aveline's skin. For a fraction of a second, her true scent, pine, midnight rain, and pure, concentrated power, bloomed in the warm air of the hall. King Cedric froze. The silver goblet in his massive hand buckled slightly under a sudden, crushing grip. His nostrils flared, his dark eyes snapping wide open as the ancient, dormant wolf inside his soul slammed against his ribs, howling a single, deafening word. The great hall, moments ago, a cacophony of drunken boasting and political maneuvering, suddenly felt as though the air had been sucked from the room. King Cedric Valerius slowly stood up from his carved throne. The sheer size of him, combined with the sudden spike of his dominant alpha aura, forced the lesser wolves in the room to involuntarily bare their necks. The music from the minstrel's gallery died an agonizing death as a lute string snapped loudly in the heavy silence. Aveline, frozen in terror with the silver pitcher still in her hands, stopped breathing. She knew he had caught a scent. The way his head tilted, the way his dark, predatory eyes scanned the immediate vicinity. He was tracking. Lady Beatrice, oblivious to the sudden shift in the spiritual atmosphere, stood up beside him, her perfectly painted lips forming a confused pout. "My king? Is something amiss? Shall I have the guards close the doors?" Cedric didn't even look at her. He stepped down from the dais. Every courtier watched in breathless anticipation. Did he smell an assassin? Was there poison in the wine? The Alpha King moved with terrifying, deliberate slowness, bypassing the lords, stepping past the generals who had bled for him, until he stopped directly in front of a trembling, ash-smudged servant girl, huddled near the edge of the royal table. Aveline stared at his scuffed leather boots, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of him, wood smoke, cold steel, and raw, intoxicating power, was overwhelming. "Look at me," Cedric commanded. His voice was not a shout, but a deep, resonant rumble that vibrated through the stone floor and straight into Aveline's bones. Slowly, fighting the urge to run, she lifted her chin. Her large, frightened hazel eyes met his piercing, stormy gaze. For a moment, time seemed to fracture. Cedric's chest heaved once, a massive intake of breath as he inhaled her scent directly. The beast beneath his skin roared in absolute triumph. He reached out. Gasps echoed around the hall as the Alpha King's large, calloused hand gently wiped away a streak of black soot from Aveline's pale cheek. The contrast between the deadly monarch and the fragile, filthy maid was staggering. "Mine," Cedric whispered, the word laced with the unmistakable resonant hum of the Alpha's decree. "Mate." For 3 seconds, the great hall was dead silent. Then Lord Percival let out a nervous chuckle. It started as a low snort, breaking the tension, and within moments the entire hall erupted. They thought it was a joke, a cruel theatrical jest to humiliate the overly ambitious noblewomen. Laughter bounced off the vaulted ceilings. High-born ladies giggled behind their velvet fans, while the knights slapped their knees. "A brilliant jest, Your Majesty," shouted Sir Gideon Croft from the lower tables, "to show the high ladies that even a scullery rat is preferable to their nagging." But Lady Beatrice wasn't laughing. Her face had drained of colour, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and fury. She looked at Cedric's face, his unwavering, deadly serious expression, and realized the horrifying truth. "Cedric," Beatrice hissed, forgetting all formalities in her shock. "You cannot be serious. She is a peasant, a human, a dirty, nameless creature who scrubs the filth from our boots. You are the Alpha King. The laws of Ethelgard expressly forbid the commingling of royal blood with the lowborn." The laughter in the hall died abruptly as the king slowly turned his head toward Beatrice. The air grew instantly freezing. A low, guttural growl ripped from Cedric's chest, a sound so primal and threatening that several courtiers stumbled backward, knocking over their chairs. "You will address your Luna with respect, Beatrice of House Harrington." Cedric's voice was a lethal whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "Or I will tear your tongue from your mouth and feed it to the hounds." Panic erupted. Lord Thomas Alistair, the king's oldest advisor and a rigid traditionalist, rushed forward, his robes billowing. "Your Majesty, I beg of you, reason. The mating bond can be flawed, manipulated by dark magic. To crown a maid is to invite rebellion. The allied houses will withdraw their banners. You cannot place a crown on a girl with no lineage, no wolf, and no name." Cedric turned back to Aveline, who was shaking so violently the pitcher slipped from her hands, clattering loudly against the stone, splashing dark wine like blood across the floor. He ignored the spilling liquid, grasping her shoulders with unexpected gentleness. "Tell them your name," Cedric ordered softly, looking only at her. "Aveline," she choked out, a tear finally escaping and cutting a clean path through the dirt on her face. "Just Aveline. Please, sire, they are right. You must be mistaken. I am nothing." "You are everything," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her collarbone. Then, without warning, his grip tightened, and he ripped the collar of her coarse linen dress down an inch, exposing the flesh of her left shoulder to the entire hall. Aveline gasped in horror, trying to cover herself, but Cedric held her fast. "Look," Cedric commanded the room, his voice booming like thunder. Lord Thomas Alistair squinted, stepping closer. There, stamped perfectly into the pale skin of the maid's shoulder, was a deep crimson birthmark. It was the undeniable shape of a crescent moon, perfectly intertwined with a silver wolf's claw. Lord Thomas dropped to his knees as if all the bones in his legs had vanished. The colour rushed from his face. "By the ancestors," he whispered, his voice trembling with a terror that infected the entire room. "It cannot be. That line was eradicated 50 years ago. The royal house of Rowan, the true sovereigns of the Northern Star. The silence that followed was no longer one of shock, but of absolute paralyzing fear. The people who had laughed at her, the people who had kicked her and forced her to scrub the ashes, realized all at once that they had not been tormenting a peasant. They had been enslaving the lost heir of the most powerful Lycan bloodline in history, and the Alpha King had just given her the throne. The revelation sent shockwaves through the Great Hall, shattering the fragile political ecosystem of Ethelgard. The House of Rowan was not merely a noble lineage. They were the original monarchs of the Northern Star, a sacred bloodline believed to have been entirely slaughtered by rogue mercenaries half a century ago. It was said that the Rowan blood carried the direct blessing of the moon goddess, a purity of magic and lycanthropy that commanded the elements themselves. For the ruling class, who had seized power in the vacuum of the Rowan's destruction, Aveline's existence was not just a shock. It was a catastrophic threat to their legitimacy. Duke Montgomery Harrington, Lady Beatrice's father, was the first to recover from the paralyzing fear. He was a broad-shouldered, silver-haired alpha, whose ambition was as ruthless as his blade. He slammed his heavy silver goblet onto the wooden table, the loud clatter breaking the stunned silence. "Blasphemy!" the Duke roared, his eyes flashing a dangerous amber as he stepped out from behind the high table. "This is a parlor trick, a forgery woven by some hedge witch to disrupt the succession. Do you expect us to believe that the last surviving heir of the Rowan dynasty has been scrubbing our chamber pots? The king is under a spell." Lady Beatrice, recovering her composure, seized upon her father's words. She pointed a trembling, accusing finger at Aveline. "She has bewitched him. Look at her. She has no wolf, no aura, no strength. The Rowans were legendary warriors, not cowering mice who hide in the ash pits." King Cedric moved so fast that the human eye could barely track him. In a blur of dark motion, he was standing directly in front of Duke Montgomery, his hand clamped around the older alpha's throat. The king lifted the massive duke entirely off the ground. The surrounding guards drew their swords, but Cedric's lethal gaze dared any man to step forward. "You dare question your king's decree in his own hall?" Cedric's voice was a low, vibrating growl that rattled the weapons in their racks. "I do not need a parlor trick to recognize my fated mate. Her scent, her soul, her blood, they sing to my wolf. If you speak another word of treason, Harrington, I will end your line tonight." Aveline watched the violence with wide, terrified eyes. Her entire reality was fracturing. She had spent her life believing she was an abandoned human bastard, cast aside by the world. But as Cedric's protective fury filled the room, something deep and ancient within her began to stir. The birthmark on her shoulder, a mark she had always been told was a demon's curse, a brand she had painstakingly hidden with dirt and rough cloth, started to burn with a strange, icy heat. Memories, fractured and hazy, clawed at the edges of her mind. A woman with silver hair singing a lullaby. The smell of burning cedar. The terrifying screams in the dark. And a desperate run through a snowy forest. Cedric dropped the gasping duke to the stone floor and turned back to Aveline. The predatory rage vanished from his face the moment he looked at her. He stripped off his heavy dire wolf cloak and wrapped it gently around her trembling shoulders, concealing her torn dress and the sacred mark. "My king," Lord Thomas Alastair interrupted, his voice trembling but respectful as he remained on his knees. We do not doubt your bond, but the laws of Ethelgard are ancient and absolute. If this girl is truly the last Rowan, and your fated Luna, she must pass the ordeal of the silver moon. She must stand in the sacred circle on the night of the full moon and summon her wolf. If the goddess embraces her, no lord or lady in this kingdom will ever dare question her reign. If she fails, she is an impostor, and the law demands her execution. The hall held its collective breath. The ordeal was a brutal, ancient ritual. A human or a weak wolf subjected to the raw, unfiltered magic of the sacred circle would be burned alive from the inside out. It was a death sentence for a frail maid. Cedric's jaw tightened, his instincts roaring to take Aveline and slaughter anyone who stood in their way. But Aveline, feeling the sudden, overwhelming weight of the cloak and the intoxicating safety of Cedric's scent, found a courage she didn't know she possessed. The burning in her shoulder was spreading to her veins, a dormant power awakening from a 19-year slumber. She reached out, her small, blistered fingers gently touching Cedric's armored forearm. The Alpha King looked down, surprised by the contact. "I will do it," Aveline said, her voice surprisingly steady, echoing in the quiet hall. "If I am to be your queen, I will not hide behind your sword. I will face the ordeal." Duke Montgomery sneered, clutching his bruised throat. "The full moon rises in 2 days. Enjoy your final nights in the castle, little maid." For the next 2 days, the keep was a hive of paranoid whispers and frantic preparations. Aveline was moved from the damp cellars to the royal chambers, her coarse rags replaced by gowns of spun silk and velvet. Yet the luxury felt like a gilded queue. She spent her hours pacing the large stone balconies, staring up at the waxing moon, feeling an unbearable pressure building in her chest. Cedric rarely left her side. He refused to let the court physicians or the serving women touch her, insisting on tending to her needs himself. He brushed her hair, fed her from his own plate, and sat by the fire, telling her the true history of her family. The Rowans, the white wolves of the north. But in the shadows of the castle, Lady Beatrice and her father were not idle. They knew that if Aveline survived, their grip on the throne was lost forever. They met with a disgraced apothecary in the lower dungeons, purchasing a vial of powdered wolfsbane and shadow root. The plan was simple: taint the sacred incense used in the ordeal. It would suppress any lycanthropic shift and poison the girl's lungs, ensuring she died screaming in front of the entire court, proving her a fraud once and for all. The night of the full moon bathed the courtyard of Winterbourne Keep in an ethereal silver glow. The sacred circle, an ancient ring of runic stones dating back to the first Lycan kings, pulsed with a faint, otherworldly light. The entire court had gathered, wrapped in heavy furs against the biting chill of the midnight air. The atmosphere was thick with tension, bloodlust, and desperate ambition. Aveline stood at the edge of the circle, dressed in a simple, flowing white gown. She looked impossibly fragile against the backdrop of the massive stone walls and the towering, armored warriors that surrounded the perimeter. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The burning sensation that had started in her shoulder days ago was now a raging inferno in her blood, making her skin feverish to the touch. King Cedric stood just outside the runes, his hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. He had never felt fear in battle, but as he watched his mate step toward the center of the circle, absolute terror gripped his heart. Lord Thomas Alistair stepped forward, holding a heavy silver brazier filled with woking incense. "The ordeal of the silver moon begins," he announced, his voice carrying over the whistling wind. "May the goddess reveal the truth of the blood." As Lord Thomas swung the brazier, the thick smoke drifted over Aveline. In the crowd, Lady Beatrice smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. The tainted smoke wrapped around the young maid. Almost immediately, Aveline collapsed to her knees. A violent cough racked her small frame, and she gasped for air, clutching her chest. The wolfsbane burned her throat like swallowed glass, and the shadow root dragged a dark, suffocating veil over her mind. The crowd erupted into vicious murmurs. "Look!" Duke Montgomery shouted, pointing eagerly. "She has no wolf! She chokes on the sacred air! She is a fraud!" Cedric let out a deafening roar of rage and lunged forward to break the circle, willing to burn his own soul to pull her out. But an invisible barrier of ancient magic slammed into him, throwing the massive Alpha King backward. The runes flared violently, locking the circle until the ordeal was complete. "Aveline!" Cedric screamed, striking the magical barrier with his bare fists, his knuckles splitting and bleeding against the raw magical energy. "Fight it! Fight!" Inside the circle, Aveline was drowning in agony. The poison was designed to suppress the wolf, to kill the host before the shift could occur. But Beatrice and her father had made a fatal miscalculation. They had dosed her for a normal wolf. They did not understand the sheer, unadulterated power of the Rowan bloodline. As Aveline lay gasping on the cold stone, her vision going dark, the voice of the Alpha King breached the suffocating silence in her mind. His desperation, his absolute devotion, acted as a spark in a powder keg. The mating bond snapped fully into place, a tether of pure light connecting her soul to his. She remembered. She remembered her mother's silver hair. She remembered the ambush in the snow. She remembered her mother pressing a bloody hand to her shoulder, sealing her power away with a desperate dying spell so she could hide among humans. And now, that seal was broken. The crescent moon and claw mark on Aveline's shoulder erupted with blinding, radiant silver light, burning right through the fabric of her dress. The tainted smoke was instantly incinerated by a shock wave of pure, frigid, magical energy that blasted outward, knocking the front row of nobles off their feet. The pain vanished, replaced by an intoxicating, earth-shattering surge of power. Aveline threw her head back, and a sound tore from her throat. Not a scream of pain, but a chilling, melodious howl that made the very stones of the keep vibrate. Bones cracked and reformed with terrifying speed. The white gown shredded into nothingness as brilliant, glowing white fur erupted from her skin. She grew larger, massive, her form bathed in the direct, concentrated light of the full moon. When the blinding light finally dimmed, the court was left staring in absolute, breathless horror and awe. Standing in the center of the circle was not a human maid, nor a standard wolf. It was a white direwolf. She was majestic and terrifying, standing nearly as tall as Cedric's destrier horse. Her coat shimmered like spun moonlight, and her eyes burned with intelligent, ancient silver fire. The legendary beast of the Rowan kings had returned. The white direwolf turned her massive head toward Lady Beatrice and Duke Montgomery. She let out a low, rumbling snarl that forced every single wolf in the courtyard, including the high-born alphas, to their knees. The sheer, overwhelming dominance of her royal aura commanded absolute submission. Even Duke Montgomery fell to the dirt, his body trembling uncontrollably against his will. The magical barrier dissolved. King Cedric did not hesitate. He stripped away his humanity in a heartbeat, shifting into his massive, pitch-black, dire wolf form. He stepped into the circle, stalking proudly toward the white wolf. The two magnificent beasts circled each other, a dance of light and shadow, before gently bumping their muzzles together. The mating bond was sealed in front of the gods and the realm. Cedric shifted back to his human form, standing naked and unashamed in the moonlight, wrapping an arm around the neck of his majestic mate. He looked out at the kneeling, terrified court. "Seize the Harringtons," Cedric commanded, his voice cold as ice. "For treason and attempted murder of your queen." Guards immediately dragged the screaming Beatrice and her father away to the dungeons. The rest of the nobles, those who had mocked and laughed at the ash-covered maid, pressed their foreheads to the cold stone, begging for mercy. They had thought her a joke. Instead, Aveline had reclaimed her throne, bringing the ultimate power back to the Northern Star and proving that true destiny can never be buried in the ashes. Thank you so much for watching this incredible tale of destiny, betrayal, and ultimate triumph. If you loved seeing Aveline transform from a mocked servant into the legendary White Direwolf Queen, please hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this story with your friends who love epic werewolf romances, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling dramas, magical twists, and royal secrets. Turn on notifications so you never miss an adventure.